We got over 1,000 heroes in the game now. That's a lot of units, isn't it? This game has been going on for, I believe, almost 7 years at this point, which is a very long time for a gacha game, especially one revolving around Fire Emblem, which, despite not even being one of the more mainstream series Nintendo has, even though it is relatively successful in its own way, has a very thriving player base in the gacha sphere, which, to be fair, it's not getting a lot of newer players, but there are a lot of players that have been sticking around for a long time, and because of that, we've gotten to the point where we've reached 1,000 heroes. But also, despite the fact that we don't even have 1,000 original Fire Emblem characters, it's no shock that they're scratching the bottom of the barrel with some of the games. That being said, it's been a very interesting ride thus far, and I figured it would be a good idea to go back and look at the original 95 heroes that we have in the game. I guess the more accurate number would be 98, because at the launch of the game, we had 95 Fire Emblem mainline characters, and then we had 3 regular playable ones, including Alphonse, Sharena, and Anna, you know, the Asker trio. But for the characters that didn't fall under that umbrella, we have a lot of Arcanea, Awakening, and Fates characters. Not really the most shocking thing, since the last 2 were probably the most popular Fire Emblem games at the time and are still relatively popular to this day, but as you can see with a lot of the newer banners, it's definitely shifted focus to maybe something like Three Houses, which again makes sense because it's also one of the more popular games in the series. Regardless, as you can tell by the chart itself, it's very apparent that a lot of the characters weren't initially planned for the game and probably still aren't, just relatively due to their popularity, but even then they didn't have a fixed idea of what exactly they were doing in the beginning, especially with a lot of the stat lines which were all over the place. But now pretty much every unit is relatively min-maxed and falls into one specific category because a lot of the game is homogenized, but that's neither here nor there. It's interesting to look at the original 95 characters that they chose to add. A lot of them aren't shocking, to be fair, it's just also some of them are more questionable than others. For example, they did have pretty much all the Awakening and Fates characters that, in my opinion, were probably some of the more recognizable and popular characters from the cast. The ones that were more so questionable were a lot of the main characters just not being added in the game, even if they weren't even the most popular. Hell, some of the characters that weren't added were extremely popular. Ike, despite being promoted across a lot of the promotional material, having original art for the title screen, and so on and so forth, wasn't in the game at launch and didn't get in for a few months after that point. They did eventually add him, but it was very questionable that out of every Fire Emblem character in the series, you wouldn't have one of your most popular additions in the game at the launch of it. That being said, he wasn't the only lord that didn't get in at the time. There was Seliph, there was Sigurd, there was Leif. Leif was probably the most unfortunate one because they didn't really have the confidence to sell him without Reinhardt, who even at the time wasn't popular, but only gained his surgence because of how broken he was at the beginning of the game. Yeah, they didn't really have a lot of confidence in Thracia, and they could still show that even to this day with the amount of characters they have in the game. But also, speaking of characters that aren't in the game, we have Valadar, who was teased before the launch and still isn't in. I don't really care as much, I just think it's funny that they were teasing him for something like Choose Your Legends, and then even to this day, he just isn't in the game. Even the other units that they teased at that point eventually got in, and I'm pretty sure they all got in within the first year of the game. The one other thing I did want to talk about was their internal IDs, which isn't exactly a new concept because it does determine which hero is what number in the game, so that's how a lot of people were able to determine that Patty is hero 1000. But at the beginning of the game, it was a lot more organized, and by organized I mean I don't think there was a very determinable way to figure out who exactly was designed first for the game, because after the initial 4 characters, which I'll go into in a second, a lot of the additions were organized by weapon type, color type, so on and so forth. And for me, it's a bit hard to believe that they designed 20 swords before they designed something like a blue tome or an axe or anything of the sort. Maybe they did, but also because it was the launch of the game, it really didn't matter by that point since they were all being added at once. As far as the ID system goes, they are organized by sword, lance, axe, bow, dagger, tomes, staves, and dragons. And on a further note, the ones that have additional colors, such as the tomes and dragons, are organized by red, blue, and green. So So as far as the original 95 characters go in the cast, Fa was the last one added, at least according to the ID system, because she is a green dragon, whereas Anna is the first one. And that's the one I wanted to get into the most. There are 4 characters that don't really follow this system because they're tutorial characters. And that isn't exactly foolproof, but it is my speculation because those are the first 4 characters that you get in the game before you can unlock anything like summoning or Alphonse and Sharena, which, by the way, don't follow 5 and 6. That would be all the swords that were added to the game. So Anna is, by definition, the first hero added to the game. Whether she was the first designed hero is entirely debatable, but there's also nothing else to go off by, so for all intensive purposes, you can assume that Asker Anna is the first hero in the game, which is kind of fitting because it's Anna and she is pretty much that secondary mascot character across the series. You have Virian at the second one because he was the original tutorial character in the game before they changed it out to Takumi, and his ID didn't change, but I'm pretty sure his ID is around like 70 something. Oh no, it's number 65. I know everyone's probably thinking, oh, who's ID number 69? He. Nice, it's Felicia. You can stop asking now. Nice. Following Virion, though, we have Matthew at number 3 and Ray at number 4. And while these weren't directly added as tutorial characters, they did show up immediately in your barracks once you finish the prerequisite maps from downloading the game. So again, for all intents and purposes, these were the 4 original characters added into the game. After that, you did unlock summoning, which is why it was probably much more organized at that point. Marth, Ogma, Navarre, and Royd followed 5 through 8, and you'll notice that a lot of these characters are organized by entry as well. So outside of the weapon type, you also have the color and the entry. So Marth follows first because he's one of the original characters from the Fire Emblem series. Ogma, Navarre, and then you jump all the way to Roy because he's the next sword that follows in line. Fur, Lynn, Crom, Lucina, Lanku, Olivia, Korin, Ryoma, Hinata, Laszlo, Selena, Alphonse, Drog, so on and so forth. You'll notice that Drog was added after the fact, and I think they're also organized by movement types. Now, as far as I'm aware, this isn't something that remains consistent as they continually add new units. There's no reason to do that as they're much more loose in what they add in terms of weapon types, color, movement types, etc, etc. This one was the beginning of the game, so I guess it made a lot more sense to keep them a lot more organized, but I highly doubt they designed somebody like Alphonse and Sharena at 21 and 33, although maybe they had an idea for something else. Regardless, having Anna at number 1 probably made it so you didn't want to have to take it immediately at face value, but I could also believe that Anna herself was the first designed hero in the game. But I guess the one other thing I noticed that was relatively interesting is that Heroes was organized as last, as the game that probably comes at the end of the series. Nowadays, I'm pretty sure it's a lot differently organized, having Heroes at the beginning of the series. Relatively interesting stuff for the most part. Also, shout out to a majority of them, if not all of them, just being completely outclassed and not really the best, but I mean, considering they were the original 95 launch characters, it's not really a big shock. And if you look at today's infograph where we have pretty much every single unit listed that is currently in the game, there's a lot more to look at. And this is one of my favorite parts about Heroes, just seeing new characters get in with new voice lines, art, etc, that they might have otherwise lacked. I think this is one of the best aspects about the game, despite it being a gacha. It's just all the representation that you get through the series. And again, despite there not being over 1,000 original characters, it makes sense that a lot of them would be designated to Alt Hell or some sort of seasonal, because that's how they could continually pad the game with new content, which isn't a bad thing by any means. But you also notice that some characters, both popular and not so popular, do get shafted to the Alt Hell section. Regardless, as you can see, they've been adding a lot of characters throughout the course of the 7 years, and some games are getting to the point where they just don't have enough left, which means they're probably not going to be getting as much content unless it's through some sort of seasonal theme. That's what happens when you have 7 years worth of content. It's just eventually some games are going to run out. Unless you're Thracia, where you basically have no additions, which is still the most hilarious thing to me. Even so, they have plenty of stuff that they can do, especially now that they have Engage in the Midst. They have a lot more characters that they could go through, and I'm fairly confident that as the game continues to go on, they'll find ways that make it so you can have more characters throughout each year. We have gotten to the point where a lot more units are getting additional alts, which again makes sense because we are running out of characters, but if they are determined starting to add new lineups to the game, then I'm pretty sure the game in a theoretical sense can be sustainable forever as long as there's a player base, which is kind of scary, but also really impressive for a Fire Emblem game. And granted, the game isn't exactly built on a perfect system, but despite all its flaws, I'm pretty happy with its existence overall. It's really cool seeing a lot of these characters given a second light, or even characters that never really got a spotlight to begin with added to the game, and as the game continually gets more support, we'll see more of that in action in the coming years, or whatever how long they decide to keep the game going for. The game made over $1 billion, I don't think they're shutting it off all too much. And that's more or less the original state of Faye with the original 95 characters and where we're at today. Kudos for making it this far. I think a lot of people were kind of surprised at that point, but you know what? Good on you. Also, Valadar not being in the game is still super hilarious.